Put two portraits side by side. Go on. Do it right now. On the left, Queen Mary, taken sometime in the 1930s at the height of her reign as consort. Ramrod spine, chin lifted, jaw set like it was carved from Portland stone. A brooch pinned high on the left shoulder, triple strand of pearls falling against a structured gown. Hands clasped over a handbag on the left arm. A toque hat adding 6 inches of height, making her impossible to miss in any crowd. On the right, Queen Elizabeth II. Any official portrait from the 1950s onward. Pick one. Doesn't matter which. Same spine, same chin, same jaw. That broad, squared-off jawline that made both their faces look like they belonged on currency. Same brooch placement, high and left. Same pearls, same handbag, same arm, same position. Same expression. Not a frown, not a smile, but something in between that communicated one thing above all else. I am not going anywhere. Now here's the thing most people miss. That resemblance isn't coincidence. It isn't even genetics. Not entirely. Elizabeth II didn't just happen to look like her grandmother. She was built to, piece by piece, year by year, by a woman who understood, better than almost anyone alive in the 20th century, that a queen is not born, a queen is made. And Queen Mary made Elizabeth. She made her in the drawing rooms of Marlborough House. She made her in the galleries of the Victoria and Albert Museum. She made her through carefully chosen tutors and calculated interventions and a philosophy of duty so absolute, it bordered on the religious. Most people credit Elizabeth's parents for the monarch she became. Some credit the war. A few credit Prince Philip. They're all wrong, or at least, they're all looking at the wrong architect. The architect was a woman born into genteel poverty in Kensington Palace on 26 May 1867. Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, daughter of a prince with impeccable blood and catastrophic finances. The Tecks lived on the charity of Queen Victoria. They fled to Florence in the 1880s to outrun their creditors. Young May, that's what the family called her, grew up watching the gap between royal status and actual substance, and she absorbed a lesson that would define everything that followed. Position without discipline is precarious. Only relentless self-construction bridges the gap between what you're born with and what you need to become. She bridged it. God, did she bridge it. By the time she became queen consort in 1910, Mary of Teck had transformed herself from a shy, awkward, financially embarrassed princess into something approaching a monument. She'd studied the role of queen consort like a scholar preparing for the most important examination of her life, reading about her predecessors, analyzing their failures, developing a theory she'd spend 4 decades proving. Her conclusion? The queen's primary function was to embody the permanence and dignity of the crown. Posture wasn't vanity. It was duty. Looking like a queen was inseparable from being one. So she trained herself. The ramrod spine, the squared shoulders, the lifted chin, the toques, those tall, close-fitting, elaborately decorated hats that created an unmistakable silhouette in any room. The structured gowns layered with jewels, the brooches pinned high on the left shoulder, always visible. The pearls, always present. She reportedly told a lady-in-waiting that the people expected to see a queen, and she intended to give them one. But the visual performance was just the surface layer. Underneath it ran something far more demanding, a concept of duty that required something close to the annihilation of the private self. Personal preferences, personal grievances, personal sorrows. These were luxuries the institution couldn't afford. Never complain, never explain. The phrase has been attributed to everyone from Disraeli to the Royal Navy, but it became synonymous with the House of Windsor because of how completely Mary lived it. Not as a motto, as an absolute law, and her life tested that law relentlessly. When her youngest son, Prince John, died on the 18th of January 1919, he was 13, had suffered severe epilepsy, had been raised largely apart from the family at Wood Farm, Sandringham. Mary mourned in private and never let grief disrupt the public machinery. When George V died on the 20th of January 1936, her first instinct wasn't to weep. It was to take her eldest son's hand and kiss it, an act of fealty. The wife became the subject instantaneously because the code demanded it. Her children paid for this. They found her remote, formal, sometimes frighteningly distant. The Duke of Windsor wasn't wrong when he complained that his mother couldn't show simple human affection. But here's what makes it tragic rather than simply cold. Mary knew. Her closest friend, Mabel, Countess of Airlie, recorded in her memoir, Thatched with Gold, that Mary once confided, with uncharacteristic vulnerability, that she'd always found it difficult to express her feelings to her children. She loved them deeply. She simply couldn't show it. The code wouldn't permit it. Remember that gap between what she felt and what she showed. Elizabeth inherited that too, every bit of it. So that's the forge. That's where the code was made, in Florence, in Kensington Palace, in the long years of self-construction that turned a shy girl into the most imposing queen consort of the 20th century. Now watch what happens when it gets transmitted. On the 11th of December 1936, Edward VIII abdicated the throne for Wallis Simpson, and two things broke simultaneously. Mary's heart. Her eldest son had, in her reckoning, committed a moral catastrophe, an act of self-indulgence so profound it threatened the survival of the institution she'd spent her life serving. She wrote to Edward afterwards in controlled fury, telling him she couldn't comprehend how he could have deserted his duty. She never fully forgave him. But the second thing that broke was the old plan, the safe assumption that Elizabeth would never need the throne. Suddenly, the stammering, reluctant Duke of York was King George VI. His 10-year-old daughter was heir presumptive to the throne of the United Kingdom and the British Empire, and Mary had watched one heir fail, spectacularly. She'd seen what happened when a monarch was charming and modern and utterly unequipped for sacrifice. She wasn't going to watch it happen again. She looked at this granddaughter, steady, serious, unnervingly self-possessed for a child, and saw exactly the raw material she needed. That's when the project began in earnest. Before the abdication, Princess Elizabeth's education had been pleasant and profoundly inadequate for a future head of state. Her governess, Marion Crawford, Crawfie, as everyone called her, taught the princesses reading, writing, arithmetic, a bit of history, a bit of geography. The Queen Mother, who'd grown up at Glamis Castle in a household full of laughter and warmth and children playing in gardens, wanted her daughters to have the same kind of happy, relaxed childhood she'd enjoyed. Music, literature, kindness, domestic arts, accomplishments befitting an aristocratic Englishwoman, not the curriculum for a future constitutional monarch. Mary found this approach inadequate to the point of alarm. She didn't stage an open confrontation. Mary was far too shrewd for that. She understood the delicacy of overruling a daughter-in-law she needed as an ally. Instead, she ran a steady campaign. Suggestions first, then supplementation, then direct personal instruction. A quiet, persistent pressure that reshaped Elizabeth's education from the inside out, so gradually that the Queen Mother could never point to a single moment of overt interference. James Pope Hennessy, who received unprecedented access to Mary for his official biography published in 1959, documented her deep concern that Elizabeth wasn't being prepared with sufficient rigor for what lay ahead. The tension between these two women, Mary's rigorous monarchical preparation versus the Queen Mother's protective warmth, became the central educational drama of Elizabeth's childhood. It wasn't a war. It was more like a tectonic shift. Two philosophies of what a princess needed grinding against each other in the private spaces of the royal household, and the child caught between them absorbing both. The warmth from her mother, the steel from her grandmother. George VI, caught between his mother and his wife, sided with his mother on this particular battlefield. His relationship with Mary was one of deep love, complicated by awe. He'd watched her navigate the abdication with a composure he himself struggled to match, and he knew her judgment on monarchical survival was probably sounder than his own. He'd seen what insufficient preparation produced. His brother was living in exile in France, proof of the concept. The most consequential result of Mary's pressure was the appointment of Henry Martin, Vice Provost of Eton College, as Princess Elizabeth's tutor in constitutional history and law. This wasn't a minor curriculum adjustment. This was a fundamental reorientation. Martin began tutoring Elizabeth in 1939, when she was 13, and continued for years, teaching her the intricacies of the British Constitution, the history of Parliament, the relationship between Crown and government, the precedents that constrained and empowered a sovereign. And these weren't vague civics lessons. Martin was a serious constitutional scholar, and he treated his royal pupil with the same intellectual rigor he brought to the boys at Eton. They studied Walter Bagehot's The English Constitution, the foundational 1867 text that defined the monarch's three rights: the right to be consulted, the right to encourage, and the right to warn. Elizabeth didn't just read Bagehot, she absorbed him. Decades later, prime ministers from Churchill to Blair would discover that the Queen knew Bagehot's framework better than they did, and she wielded those three rights with a precision that consistently caught new premiers off guard. Martin also walked her through the great constitutional crises of British history: the limits of royal prerogative, the evolution of parliamentary sovereignty, the Reform Acts, the precise mechanics of how a constitutional monarch could exert influence without overstepping authority. He was giving her a map of the invisible cage she would inhabit for the rest of her life, and teaching her how to move within it with maximum effect. The precise chain of causation, who first proposed Martin, is a matter of biographical debate, but the weight of evidence strongly suggests Mary's pressure was the decisive factor. Without her insistence that Elizabeth needed constitutional grounding beyond anything Crofty could provide, those tutorials almost certainly would never have happened. But the formal education was only half of it, maybe less. Mary took Elizabeth on outings, not casual family trips, structured lessons disguised as afternoon excursions. The Wallace Collection, the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Tower of London, Hampton Court Palace. She walked her granddaughter through galleries of royal portraits, explaining who each monarch was, what they'd done well, what they'd done badly. She pointed out objects from the royal collection and explained their provenance, their significance, their place in the long story of the crown. This wasn't sightseeing. This was a seminar in monarchical consciousness, teaching Elizabeth to see herself not as a girl who might one day wear a crown, but as a link in a chain stretching back centuries and forward into centuries not yet imagined. Crofty documented these outings in her 1950 memoir, The Little Princesses, and whatever you think of Crofty's betrayal in publishing it, her descriptions of Mary's educational intensity are corroborated by other sources. And Mary didn't do this with both granddaughters equally. That's the tell. She was fond of Margaret, loved her, but Margaret wasn't the project. Elizabeth was the project. The time Mary spent with Elizabeth was qualitatively different, more structured, more instructive, more laden with the unspoken weight of something immense being prepared for. The visits to Marlborough House, Mary's London residence, weren't casual afternoon teas. They were working sessions disguised as family time. Mary would show Elizabeth items from her extensive collection of art and antiques. She was a voracious collector, a serious reader, a woman of considerably greater intellectual curiosity than her public image as a stiff, bejeweled figurehead suggested. And she cultivated that same curiosity in her granddaughter with the patience of a master gardener tending a sapling she fully expected to grow into an oak. Margaret got the warmth. Elizabeth got the program. During the war, direct contact dropped sharply. Mary was evacuated to Badminton House in Gloucestershire at the government's insistence. The princesses were sheltered at Windsor Castle, miles of English countryside between them, but the structures Mary had built kept operating without her, like a machine that no longer needed its engineer standing over it. The Martin tutorials continued throughout the war. The curriculum she'd fought for persisted, even when she couldn't supervise it directly. The code had been installed deeply enough that it ran on its own, and you could see it running. On 13 October 1940, 14-year-old Princess Elizabeth made her first public broadcast on the BBC's Children's Hour program. Her voice was high and clear, and astonishingly composed for a girl of 14 addressing the children of the Commonwealth in the middle of a bombing campaign. "We know, every one of us, that in the end all will be well," she said. "For God will care for us and give us victory and peace." The words were scripted, of course, but the delivery, steady, unfaltering, devoid of theatrics or self-pity. That was pure Mary. No complaining, no explaining. A child performing her duty with the same iron composure her grandmother had demonstrated through the deaths of sons, the loss of a king, the abdication of an heir. The BBC broadcast was Elizabeth's first public audition as a future monarch, and she passed it, because Mary had already taught her how the role was played. At Badminton, Mary herself kept embodying the code with a ferocity that slightly alarmed her hosts, the Duke and Duchess of Beaufort. She was 73 years old and working like she was 30, organizing salvage drives, visiting troops, inspecting war production, ordering the clearing of overgrown land with military precision. Ivy stripped from walls, scrub hacked from fields, everything repurposed for the war effort. The code didn't contain a retirement clause. And then the code was tested again. On August 25, 1942, her son Prince George, Duke of Kent, was killed in a military air crash. Another child dead. Another devastation to absorb. Mary reportedly took the blow in silence, then asked what needed to be done next. No public tears, no collapse. The institution required her upright, and upright she remained. By 1945, Elizabeth herself was demonstrating the code in action, not just in broadcasts, but in uniform. In February 1945, at 18, she joined the Women's Auxiliary Territorial Service, the ATS, becoming the first female member of the royal family to serve in the armed forces. She trained as a driver and mechanic at No. 1 Mechanical Transport Training Center in Camberley, Surrey. She stripped engines, she changed tires, she drove military vehicles through the mud of training grounds. The press loved it. The princess getting her hands dirty, mucking in with ordinary women. But look at it through the lens of the code. This wasn't rebellion against royal stiffness. This was duty, service, the subordination of personal comfort to institutional need. Mary's philosophy, expressed in grease-stained overalls instead of pearls and a toque. Elizabeth could have sat out the war entirely, safe behind the walls of Windsor Castle. Instead, she served. Because the code demanded it, not merely the appearance of sacrifice, but actual sacrifice, even when nobody of rank was watching. Mary approved. Of course, she approved. This was the program working exactly as designed. So that's the training, the education, the outings, the bearing, the code installed so deeply it had become indistinguishable from instinct. But there's one more arena of Mary's influence that rarely gets discussed. and it involves the man Elizabeth chose to marry. Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten was, by Mary's standards, a problem. Not because of his character. She could see his intelligence, his vigor, his suitability as a consort. The problem was his family. Philip was a Mountbatten, nephew of Lord Louis Mountbatten, a man whose ambition and self-promotion Mary viewed with deep suspicion. The Mountbattens were modernizers, operators, people who saw the monarchy not as a sacred trust to be preserved unchanged, but as an institution to be adapted, reformed, brought into line with the 20th century. Mary had spent her entire life perfecting the machinery of tradition. She didn't trust people who wanted to tinker with it. And there was a specific fear, well documented in royal biographical sources, that the Mountbatten name and influence would infiltrate the House of Windsor through the marriage. Lord Mountbatten openly boasted that the House of Mountbatten now reigned when Elizabeth married Philip. Mary was horrified. She, along with the Queen Mother and others in the old guard, pushed back hard, and their pressure was a significant factor in the eventual decision that the royal house would remain Windsor, not become Mountbatten. Philip, famously bitter about this, complained that he was the only man in the country who couldn't give his own children his surname. But Mary's view prevailed. The institution was bigger than any individual, even a husband, even a prince. This wasn't cruelty toward Philip. It was consistency. The same code that had required Mary to kiss her son's hand instead of weeping at her husband's deathbed now required that the Windsor name be protected from Mountbatten ambition. Personal feelings, Philip's hurt, Elizabeth's discomfort at the tension, were subordinate to institutional survival. Always. That was the code. And Elizabeth, caught between the husband she loved and the grandmother who'd shaped her, ultimately sided with the code, as she would. Again and again and again, for 70 years. By the time the war ended and the marriage was settled, what emerged was a young Princess Elizabeth who was recognizably, unmistakably, her grandmother's production. The physical resemblance had deepened with maturity. Both women shared that broad, set jaw, that wide-set facial symmetry, that mouth that naturally settled into a firm, neutral line, communicating absolute self-possession. Courtiers noticed. They couldn't not notice. As one forum of royal watchers put it decades later, the resemblance between Queen Elizabeth II and Queen Mary was something people had thought about for many years. But the face was just the surface. What really struck observers was the bearing. Elizabeth stood as Mary stood, walked as Mary walked, held herself with a discipline that went far beyond good deportment into something that felt almost architectural. Then came the proof. 21st April 1947, Cape Town, South Africa. Princess Elizabeth's 21st birthday broadcast to the Commonwealth. Listen to the words. I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong. My whole life. Not my career, not my years of active service, her entire existence, and that subordinate clause, whether it be long or short. Acknowledge the possibility of early death with a calm no ordinary 21-year-old possesses. This wasn't a girl making a nice speech. This was a woman who'd already accepted that personal happiness, personal desire, personal feeling itself would be permanently subordinated to the demands of the role. That conception of duty, quasi-religious, total, unconditional, was Mary's conception, transmitted over a decade of teaching, example, and the sheer gravitational force of her personality. Elizabeth didn't arrive at it independently. She was given it, and she accepted it. And she would live it for 75 years, without flinching. 7 months later, on November 20th, 1947, the visual transfer became literal. Elizabeth married Philip at Westminster Abbey wearing Queen Mary's fringe tiara on her head, a stunning diamond piece originally made in 1919. The grandmother's jewels on the granddaughter's head, not alone, a transmission. And this was only the beginning of the physical inheritance. The girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, that diamond and pearl piece purchased with funds raised by a committee and given to Mary as a wedding gift back on the 6th of July, 1893, became Elizabeth's everyday tiara, the one she wore more than any other for nearly 70 years. She could have commissioned entirely new pieces. She was the wealthiest woman in the Commonwealth. Instead, she reached back into her grandmother's collection, again and again. Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee brooch, bequeathed by Mary in 1953, appeared on Elizabeth's chest at event after event, decade after decade. The Richmond brooch, another of Mary's pieces, showed up on Elizabeth as late as June 2016, paired with a primrose yellow Angela Kelly outfit. Brooches pinned in the same high-left position Mary favored. Tiaras settled onto her head that had first been settled onto Mary's. Every appearance became a small act of continuation. Not just wearing jewelry, wearing her grandmother. Wearing the code. And the code held for 70 years, through the loss of the empire, through the annus horribilis of 1992, when she stood before cameras and acknowledged the disasters of that year with a composure that would have made Mary nod in grim approval. Through the death of Diana in 1997, when the public's fury at her perceived coldness was really fury at the code itself, at the very philosophy Mary had installed, the refusal to perform private grief as public spectacle. Elizabeth wasn't being cold. She was being Mary. She was doing exactly what she'd been trained to do. The public just didn't know the training existed. And then, April 2021, the funeral of Prince Philip. Elizabeth sat alone in St. George's Chapel, masked and isolated by COVID protocols, a tiny figure in black on a vast wooden pew. And she didn't crumble, didn't waver. Sat with the posture of a woman who'd been trained since childhood that this was what the crown required. Absorb the devastation, hold the spine straight, ask what comes next. Mary was nearly 70 years dead by then. The architect had been dust for decades, but the building she'd constructed was still standing. Flawless, not a crack showing. Mary would have recognized every frame of that footage. She'd built that woman, and she knew it, or at least she knew the project had succeeded. George VI died on the 6th of February 1952, and Elizabeth acceded to the throne immediately. Mary was alive, 84 years old, frail but fully lucid. She'd lived long enough to know her granddaughter was queen. The decades of museum outings and Martin tutorials and quiet interventions and modeled behavior had produced the exact result she'd engineered. The heir she'd shaped was on the throne. But she didn't live to see the crown placed. Queen Mary died on 24th March 1953, 10 weeks before the coronation scheduled for 2nd June. She'd left explicit instructions. Her death must not delay the ceremony. Even dying, the code operated. Duty before grief, the institution before the individual. Don't mourn me longer than necessary. Crown her. Think about the precision of that final instruction. She wasn't asking her family to grieve less. She was ordering the machinery of state not to pause on her account. Decades of self-annihilation in service to the crown, and the very last act was one more deletion of self. Don't let my death inconvenience the institution. The code, operating right up to and past the final breath. And when Elizabeth walked into Westminster Abbey on that June morning in 1953, she walked with Mary's posture, Mary's composure, Mary's code running beneath every measured system, like an operating system so deeply embedded it had become indistinguishable from the hardware. She wore jewels Mary had worn. She carried herself as Mary had taught her to carry herself. She held a conception of duty Mary had given her when she was 10 years old, sitting in the galleries of the Wallace collection, learning that a queen was not a person but a function, and that the function demanded everything. So, the question from the beginning, nature or training? Look at the portraits again. The jaw, yes, that's genetics. You can't teach bone structure. But the spine, the chin angle, the brooch placement, the handbag position, the expression, that face that says nothing and communicates everything, the philosophy that a queen is a performance, and the performance is the duty, and the duty is total and unconditional and lasts until you die, that's not nature. That's a woman who spent 17 years quietly, persistently, brilliantly engineering a monarch. From the museums to the Martin tutorials to the Badgett readings to the jewel cases to the emotional architecture beneath it all. The inability to express warmth in private, the instinct to absorb grief in silence, the absolute refusal to let the personal contaminate the institutional. Mary built Elizabeth, and Elizabeth wore her grandmother, her posture, her jewels, her code, her cost, for 70 years on the throne without once breaking character. The crown was new, but the woman wearing it was a Queen Mary production, had been since she was 10, and by the time Mary was finished, by the time the training had soaked so deeply into the bone that it was indistinguishable from the person, it didn't matter anymore whether it was nature or nurture. They'd become the same thing. Subscribe for more stories like this.